Ever wondered if everything we think we know about medieval women is wrong? Could centuries of popular culture, literature, and even academic discourse have painted a completely skewed picture of what life was like for women in the Middle Ages? Number 12. Were medieval women really just glorified prisoners in their homes? One of the most common images we have of medieval women is that they were essentially trapped in their homes, locked away to cook, clean, and have babies while the men did all the important work. But this view is about as accurate as a Hollywood movie about knights in shining armor. Medieval households were actually economic units where women's work was absolutely essential, not just supplementary. Women in medieval times weren't just sitting around embroidering cushions and looking pretty. They were actively involved in household production, which included everything from brewing beer, yes, that was traditionally women's work, to making cloth, preserving food, and managing dairy production. These weren't just chores. They were crucial economic activities that contributed significantly to the household's survival and prosperity. In towns and cities, women worked alongside their husbands in family businesses. Many guilds, contrary to popular belief, did accept women, particularly widows, who often took over their husband's trade after his death. Records from medieval London, York, and other major European cities show women working as brewers, bakers, seamstresses, silk workers, and even in some cases as goldsmiths and merchants. Rural women had even less of that supposed confinement. They worked the fields alongside men during harvest times, managed gardens, tended livestock, and participated in the agricultural economy in numerous ways. Far from being delicate flowers confined to the home, medieval peasant women engaged in physically demanding labor that was vital for survival. Even noble women, who might seem most confined by our modern imagination, actually managed large household staffs and often oversaw entire estates when their husbands were away, which, considering how often men went off to war or on pilgrimages, was quite frequent. These women weren't just planning dinner menus, they were making legal decisions, resolving disputes among tenants, and managing complex economic systems. The idea that medieval women were solely domestic creatures, trapped within the four walls of their homes, says more about 19th century Victorian ideals projected backward in time than it does about the actual lives of women in the Middle Ages. The reality was far more complex, with women's economic contributions being both valued and necessary for survival. Number 11. Did medieval women have zero rights and legal standing? You've probably heard that, in medieval times, women had no legal rights whatsoever, that they were basically considered property, first of their fathers and then of their husbands. It makes for a compelling narrative about how far we've come, but it's also seriously oversimplified. Medieval law was a patchwork of different legal codes: Roman law, Germanic law, canon, church law, and local customs. And women's legal status varied significantly, depending on where they lived and what legal traditions prevailed in that region. But across many parts of medieval Europe, women could own property, make wills, bring lawsuits, and engage in business transactions. In England, after the Norman conquest, the legal doctrine of coverture did limit married women's legal independence. Under this system, a woman's legal identity was covered by her husband's. But even this wasn't as restrictive in practice as it sounds in theory. Court records show married women regularly engaging in business, sometimes with their husband's permission and sometimes seemingly on their own initiative. Widows had significant legal rights across most of Europe. They could claim a portion of their deceased husband's estate, usually 1/3 known as the widow's dower in England, manage their own property, run businesses, and act as heads of households. In many cities, guild regulations specifically protected widows' rights to continue their husband's trade. Never married women or femmes seules, single women, often had more legal rights than married women in certain contexts. They could own property, make contracts, and sue in court. In London, records show single women apprenticed to trades and working as independent businesswomen. Even more surprising to modern readers, medieval women regularly appeared in court, both as plaintiffs bringing cases and as defendants. Court records from across Europe show women suing over property disputes, debt collection, slander, and even assault. They knew their rights and weren't afraid to assert them through legal channels. In parts of southern Europe, influenced by Roman legal traditions, women often maintained more control over their property even after marriage. In northern Spain and southern France, women could inherit and control land independent of their husbands. In parts of Italy, marriage contracts specifically protected a wife's right to her dowry property. The medieval period spans nearly 1,000 years, and countless regional variations, so making sweeping statements about women's legal status is impossible. But the evidence clearly shows that medieval women were not completely powerless before the law. They had rights, albeit limited, compared to men, and they exercised those rights regularly in their daily lives. Number 10. Was all that chivalry actually good for medieval women? Knights in shining armor, rescuing damsels in distress, ladies bestowing favors on their champions, men composing flowery poetry about women's beauty and virtue. Sounds pretty romantic, right? But was chivalry actually beneficial to real medieval women? Or was it just a pretty cage? Chivalry emerged in the 12th century as a code of behavior for knights that combined military prowess with increasingly elaborate rules of courtly conduct. The ideal knight was supposed to be not just brave in battle, but also courteous, especially toward noble ladies. Poetry and romance literature of the period are filled with knights performing great deeds to win a lady's favor. But here's the catch. Chivalry wasn't about treating women as equals. It was about placing them on a pedestal as objects of devotion and symbols of purity. Real women with complex desires, ambitions, and personalities were replaced with idealized visions of feminine virtue. A woman was worthy of chivalric devotion only as long as she remained pure according to the standards of the day. Historians debate whether courtly love poetry, with its themes of knights devoted to unattainable ladies, often married to someone else, represented any kind of real social practice, or was purely a literary convention. But either way, these romantic ideals coexisted with a social structure that remained profoundly hierarchical and patriarchal. The literary depictions of women in chivalric literature were strikingly limited. Women were either perfect, pure maidens to be worshipped from afar, evil temptresses leading men astray, or passive prizes to be won through masculine competition. Rarely were they depicted as having agency or complex motivations of their own. In reality, noble women's marriages were arranged for political and economic advantage, regardless of romantic notions. A noblewoman's value was largely determined by her family connections, her potential fertility, and the lands or wealth she might bring to a marriage. Chivalric ideas about female virtue also reinforced restrictive expectations about women's behavior, emphasizing passivity, obedience, and sexual purity. For common women, chivalry offered even less. The elaborate codes of courtly behavior were exclusively concerned with noble ladies, not peasant women or townswomen. A knight who would theoretically die defending a noblewoman's honor might think nothing of mistreating women of lower social status. Still, some historians argue that chivalry did create some cultural space for women's influence in courtly settings. Noble ladies presided over courts of love in some regions, judging poetic competitions and disputes about romantic conduct. The emphasis on refined manners and emotional self-control, rather than just brute strength, may have created social environments where women could exercise soft power through cultural patronage. Chivalry, like most aspects of medieval culture, was complex and contradictory. It simultaneously elevated women as objects of devotion, while reinforcing their subordinate position. It created elaborate codes for male behavior toward high-status women, while largely ignoring the majority of women. And it substituted romantic fantasies for the often harsh realities of women's lives in a deeply hierarchical society. Number 9. Were witch hunts the medieval woman's greatest threat? When you hear witch hunts, you probably imagine medieval times filled with superstitious peasants and church authorities burning thousands of women at the stake. It's one of the most vivid images we have of medieval misogyny, but it's almost entirely wrong about the time period. The surprising truth is that systematic witch hunts were not primarily a medieval phenomenon. The large-scale witch hunts and panics that most people think of actually occurred predominantly in the early modern period, roughly 1450 to 1750, with the most intense phases happening in the 16th and 17th centuries, well after what historians consider the medieval period. During the actual Middle Ages, roughly 500 to 1500 CE, accusations of harmful magic certainly existed, but they were handled quite differently. Early medieval law codes often treated magic as a pagan practice to be discouraged rather than as a demonic conspiracy. The Church's official position for much of the medieval period was that belief in witches' powers was itself a heretical superstition. The influential Canon Episcopi, which circulated from the 10th century onward, explicitly stated that belief in night flights and magical transformations was a delusion. Magic was considered sinful, but the emphasis was on correcting error rather than hunting down conspiracies of devil worshippers. Trials for malefic magic, harmful spells, did occur in medieval courts, but they were typically treated like other crimes requiring specific accusations of harm, evidence, and following standard legal procedures of the time. They weren't accompanied by the elaborate demonological theories that would characterize later witch hunts. The specific features we associate with full-fledged witch hunts, the belief in a satanic pact, the witches' Sabbath, systematic torture to obtain confessions, mass trials, and large-scale executions developed gradually and didn't come together as a coherent package until the late 15th century, at the earliest. What changed? Several factors contributed to the shift from the medieval approach to magic to the early modern witch hunts. The development of more centralized legal systems with inquisitorial procedures, religious tensions following the Protestant Reformation, emerging demonological theories in intellectual circles, and social stresses from climate change, economic upheaval, and disease outbreaks all played a role. When large-scale witch hunting did emerge in the early modern period, it wasn't exclusively targeted at women, though they did make up the majority of victims in most regions. In some areas, like Iceland and parts of Russia, men formed the majority of those accused. The gender ratio varied significantly by region, suggesting complex local factors at work, rather than a simple story of misogyny. The total number of executions during the early modern witch hunt period is estimated at between 40 to 60 people across Europe and its colonies, a terrible tragedy, but far fewer than the millions often claimed in popular culture. For women living in the actual medieval period, dangers like childbirth complications, disease outbreaks, and food shortages posed far more serious threats than accusations of witchcraft. The medieval woman's greatest worry wasn't being labeled a witch. That particular fear would come later, in the so-called Age of Reason. Number 8. Did medieval women have zero knowledge about their own bodies? You've probably heard that medieval women were kept completely in the dark about their own bodies. That reproduction was a mysterious, superstition-filled process that women endured without any understanding or control. But how much truth is there to this perception? Medieval women actually had access to considerable knowledge about reproduction, sexuality, and healthcare, though certainly less than we have today with modern science. This knowledge was transmitted primarily through practical experience and oral traditions passed from woman to woman, rather than through formal education. Midwives were highly respected figures in medieval communities who possessed extensive empirical knowledge about childbirth, reproductive health, and women's bodies. Their expertise was gained through apprenticeship and experience, and they assisted women through pregnancy, childbirth, and the postpartum period. Far from being the ignorant old women, they were later portrayed as medieval midwives employed sophisticated techniques for managing difficult births, including turning babies in the womb and managing pain. Contrary to popular belief, written medical knowledge about women's health did exist in the Middle Ages. Medical texts like the Trotula collection, compiled in 12th century Salerno, Italy, contained detailed information about women's health issues, including menstruation, conception, pregnancy, childbirth, and gynecological conditions. While these texts reflected the medical theories of their time, based on humoral medicine, they nonetheless represent sophisticated attempts to understand and address women's health needs. Medieval women had knowledge of and used various methods of contraception. Historical records mention herbal preparations believed to prevent conception or induce menstruation, as well as mechanical methods like pessaries. Church prohibitions against contraception suggest that such practices were common enough to warrant repeated condemnation. While these methods were certainly less reliable than modern contraceptives, they demonstrate women's attempts to exercise some control over their reproductive lives. Women also produced and administered many household remedies. Middle and upper-class women were expected to know how to prepare medicines for common ailments affecting their household members. Manuscripts containing medical recipes were unkept and passed down through female family lines, accumulating practical knowledge over generations. Medieval herbals and recipe collections include numerous remedies specifically for women's health issues, including treatments for menstrual problems, breast pain, difficulties in childbirth, and postpartum care. These remedies combined herbal medicine with practical techniques based on generations of empirical observation. Of course, medieval understanding of the body was very different from our modern scientific framework. Humoral theory, which explained health as a balance of 4 bodily fluids, formed the foundation of medical knowledge. Supernatural and religious elements were integrated with natural explanations. But this doesn't mean women were simply ignorant about their bodies. They worked within the available knowledge frameworks of their time. The myth of medieval women's complete ignorance about their bodies says more about later periods' attempts to claim superiority over the superstitious Middle Ages than it does about medieval women's actual lived experiences. While their understanding wasn't based on modern anatomy and physiology, medieval women maintained and shared a significant body of practical knowledge about reproduction and women's health. Number 7. Were all medieval marriages loveless arrangements made for money and politics? It's a scene straight out of a movie. A tearful young noblewoman being forced to marry a man 3 times her age for political advantage, with no regard for her feelings or desires. But was this the universal experience for medieval women? Medieval marriage was certainly more about family alliances and economic partnerships than about romantic love as we conceive it today. Marriages, particularly among the nobility and wealthy merchant classes, were typically arranged with careful consideration of property, political connections, and social status. Parents and other family members played a significant role in negotiating matches, especially for first marriages. However, the stereotype of medieval marriages as universally loveless arrangements forced upon unwilling women oversimplifies a complex reality. Church doctrine technically required consent from both parties for a valid marriage. The Fourth Lateran Council, 1215, explicitly prohibited forced marriages, and church courts occasionally annulled marriages where genuine consent was lacking. In practice, family pressure could certainly make this consent less than free, but the principle that marriage required the agreement of both partners was established in canonical law. Evidence from letters, court cases, and literature suggests that emotional compatibility was considered desirable in medieval marriages, even if it wasn't the primary consideration. Advice literature for married couples emphasized the importance of mutual affection and respect. Parents arranging marriages often did consider whether the personalities of the potential spouses would be compatible. For common people, economic considerations were important in marriage choices, but they had more flexibility than nobility. A peasant or artisan family needed to ensure their daughter married someone who could support her, but they typically had more leeway to consider personal preferences within that economic framework. Court records occasionally show young people defying their parents' wishes and choosing their own partners, sometimes facing punishment, but often eventually reconciling with their families. Medieval people distinguished between different types of love. Passionate romantic love, often called courtly love in literary contexts, was not necessarily expected to be the foundation for marriage. But a more moderate, companionate form of affection was considered appropriate and desirable between spouses. The ideal marriage might begin with respect and grow into genuine affection over time. Literature of the period shows a range of attitudes toward marriage. While some texts portray marriages as purely political arrangements, others depict couples with genuine emotional bonds. The 14th century Book of the Knight of the Tower, written by a father for his daughters, advises them to love their future husbands and create harmonious marriages, suggesting an expectation that affection would be part of marital life. Widows and widowers remarrying often had more say in their choice of partner than people marrying for the first time. Court records show that widows in particular often chose their second husbands with considerable independence, suggesting that when freed from family pressure, medieval people did exercise personal preference in marriage. Age at first marriage varied significantly by social class and region. While noble girls might marry in their early teens, though such marriages were often not consummated immediately, common women typically married in their late teens or 20s, particularly in Northern Europe. This later marriage pattern gave women more maturity when entering marriage and possibly more input into the choice of partner. The reality of medieval marriage was far more nuanced than the simple stereotype of forced arrangements. While economic and social considerations were certainly paramount, particularly for first marriages among the elite, personal compatibility, consent, and the potential for developing affection were also recognized as important elements of a successful match. Number 6. Did men feel women spend their entire lives just having babies? The image of the medieval woman perpetually pregnant, surrounded by a dozen children, struggling through endless dangerous childbirths until her early death is deeply ingrained in our collective imagination. But does this stereotype hold up to historical scrutiny? Medieval women did typically marry with the expectation of having children, and contraception was neither reliable nor universally accepted. However, the pattern of childbearing was much more complex than the stereotype suggests. For most medieval women, their reproductive lives were characterized by a combination of factors that created a more varied experience than constant pregnancy. One key factor affecting medieval women's childbearing was the relatively late age of marriage in many parts of Europe, particularly for non-noble women. In England and much of Northern Europe, women commonly married in their mid to late 20s rather than as teenagers. This Western European marriage pattern, as demographers call it, meant that women's childbearing years were naturally limited, compared to societies where women married very young. Breastfeeding practices significantly impacted birth spacing. Medieval women typically breastfed their infants for 2 to 3 years, which provided some natural, though not foolproof, suppression of fertility. Extended nesting was recommended in medical texts and was the norm, especially among the lower classes who couldn't afford wet nurses. This practice created natural gaps between pregnancies. Historical records suggest that the average medieval woman who survived her childbearing years had around 5 to 7 live births, not the dozen or more children often imagined. Many of those children, tragically, would not survive to adulthood due to high infant and child mortality rates. But this is different from the image of women constantly bearing new children. Records of noble families where women often married younger and used wet nurses, which removed the contraceptive effect of messing, do show some examples of women having many pregnancies. But even among the nobility, birth spacing of about 2 years between children was common, and women were not continuously pregnant throughout their fertile years. Various forms of birth control, while far less effective than modern methods, were known and used in medieval times. Herbal preparations, coitus interruptus, and certain physical techniques were described in medical texts and were likely used despite religious prohibitions. The existence of penitentials, manuals for confessors, that listed penalties for contraceptive practices suggest that such methods were common enough to warrant official concern. Medieval women's lives encompassed far more than just childbearing. Even during the years when they were raising children, women were engaged in productive labor, managing households, working in family businesses, producing textiles, preparing food, and participating in agricultural work. Child care was integrated into these other responsibilities, often with the assistance of older children, extended family members, or servants in wealthier households. Women who survived their childbearing years could expect to live well into their 50s or 60s if they avoided other causes of death. This meant that many medieval women spent decades of their adult lives not having children, either before marriage, which came relatively late in many regions, or after their childbearing years had ended. The stereotype of the perpetually pregnant medieval woman fails to capture the complex reality of women's reproductive lives in the Middle Ages. While childbearing was certainly an important aspect of most married women's experience, it was neither continuous throughout their lives nor their sole purpose or occupation. Number 5 were medieval women, completely illiterate and uneducated. The stereotype of the medieval woman as completely illiterate and excluded from all forms of education persists strongly in popular imagination. But the reality of women's education and literacy in the Middle Ages was far more nuanced and varied than this simplistic view suggests. Literacy rates in the medieval period were certainly lower than today for both men and women, but the gender gap in literacy varied significantly depending on social class, time, period, and region. Among the nobility, female literacy was relatively common, especially by the later Middle Ages. Noble girls were often taught to read, though their education typically differed from that of their brothers. Convents served as important centers of female education throughout the medieval period. Nuns needed to be literate to read religious texts and perform liturgical duties. Many convents maintained libraries and scriptoria, writing rooms, where manuscripts were copied and sometimes composed. Girls sent to convents for education, even those who didn't become nuns, received instruction in reading and often writing as well. Evidence of women's literacy comes from multiple sources. We have letters written by women, books known to have been owned by women, and wills in which women bequeathed books to others. Women appear as scribes in some manuscript colophons, notes at the end identifying the copyist. And artistic depictions show women reading and writing. Merchant and artisan. Women in towns often needed practical literacy skills for business purposes. Account books, business correspondence, and guild records sometimes show evidence of women's participation in these written aspects of commercial life. While formal commercial education was less accessible to girls, many would have learned these skills within family businesses. By the later Middle Ages, lay literacy was increasing, and women were part of this trend. Books of Hours, prayer books for lay people, were particularly popular among wealthy women, and many surviving examples show signs of regular use. These books were not only read, but sometimes annotated by their female owners, demonstrating active engagement with texts. Medieval women didn't just consume written works, they also produced them. Writers like Christine de Pizan, Marie de France, Hildegard of Bingen, Julian of Norwich, Marjorie Kempe, and others created significant literary and intellectual works. While these women were exceptional, their existence demonstrates that paths to advanced education and literary expression were not completely closed to women. The education medieval girls received was certainly different from boys' education and was more focused on practical skills, religious instruction, and the knowledge needed to manage a household than on classical learning or professional training. However, this doesn't mean it wasn't valuable or substantial. Noble and wealthy urban girls learned household management, basic medical knowledge, music, needlework, and sometimes languages in addition to regional variations were significant. In parts of Italy during the Renaissance, which overlaps with the later Middle Ages, humanist education began to include some elite women. In Islamic parts of medieval Spain, evidence suggests some women received sophisticated literary education. In Byzantine territories, aristocratic women often received extensive education in literature and sometimes science. The myth of universal female illiteracy in the Middle Ages stems partly from looking only at formal educational institutions, like universities, which indeed largely excluded women. But education took many forms in medieval society, and women accessed knowledge through family instruction, convent schools, private tutors, practical apprenticeship, and self-study. While medieval women certainly faced greater barriers to education than men did, and while literacy rates were lower for women than men across all social classes, the stereotype of the completely uneducated medieval woman doesn't hold up to historical evidence. Many women were literate and educated according to the standards and needs of their time and social position. Number 4. Were all medieval women completely powerless in religion? When we think of medieval Christianity, we often picture a completely male-dominated institution where women were relegated to passive roles with no authority or voice. But was the religious experience of medieval women really so limited? The formal church hierarchy was indeed exclusively male in medieval Western Christianity. Women could not be priests, bishops, or popes, and were excluded from the official positions that came with institutional power and doctrinal authority. This significant limitation meant women could not administer sacraments or participate in church councils where theological matters were decided. However, within these structural constraints, medieval women found numerous ways to participate actively in religious life and sometimes exercise remarkable spiritual authority. Perhaps most notably, women could join religious orders as nuns, taking formal vows and dedicating their lives to religious service. Female monasticism provided an alternative life path that didn't involve marriage and childbearing, giving women a legitimate space outside conventional domestic roles. Abbesses, who led female monastic communities, wielded considerable power. They managed large estates, supervised dozens or even hundreds of nuns, controlled significant financial resources, and sometimes had jurisdiction over nearby territories and their residents. Some abbesses were even granted quasi-episcopal powers, though these were gradually restricted as the church hierarchy became more formalized. Powerful medieval abbesses, like Hildegard of Bingen, commanded respect from kings and popes alike. The medieval period saw the emergence of influential female mystics whose visions and spiritual writings gained wide recognition. Women like Julian of Norwich, Catherine of Siena, Bridget of Sweden, and Mechthild of Magdeburg claimed direct communication with God, which gave their words a special authority that could sometimes circumvent, or at least complement, the institutional authority of male clergy. Female saints were venerated throughout the medieval period, serving as powerful religious models and intercessors. The cult of the Virgin Mary reached unprecedented heights during the Middle Ages, placing a female figure at the center of popular devotion. While this emphasis on Mary's purity and obedience reinforced certain gender norms, it also elevated feminine virtues and created a space for women's special relationship with the divine. Beyond formal religious roles, women were often the primary transmitters of religious knowledge within families. Mothers typically took responsibility for children's religious education, teaching prayers, biblical stories, and moral principles. This crucial role in forming the next generation's religious consciousness gave women significant cultural influence, even without formal authority. Women were active participants in lay religious movements that flourished in the later Middle Ages. Beguines in Northern Europe formed semi-religious communities of women who lived spiritual lives without taking formal monastic vows, supporting themselves through work while engaging in prayer, charitable activities, and religious discussion. Similarly, tertiaries affiliated with mendicant orders like the Franciscans and Dominicans allowed women to participate in organized religious life while remaining in the secular world. Women were often prominent in charitable works associated with religious practice. They founded and supported hospitals, almshouses, and other institutions caring for the poor, sick, and vulnerable. Through these activities, women exercised meaningful influence in their communities under the umbrella of religious devotion. The late medieval period saw increasing restrictions on women's religious roles in response to movements judged heretical and concerns about women claiming prophetic or teaching authority. Beguines faced suspicion. Female mystics were subjected to greater scrutiny, and women's religious communities were placed under stricter male supervision. These reactions suggest that women's religious activities had become influential enough to provoke institutional concern. While medieval women were certainly excluded from the formal power structures of the church hierarchy, characterizing them as completely powerless in the religious sphere oversimplifies a complex reality. Many women found ways to claim spiritual authority, create religious communities, influence theological discourse, and participate actively in the religious life of their times. Number 3. Did medieval women have zero say in politics? The image of medieval politics as an exclusively male domain where women had absolutely no influence is deeply embedded in popular consciousness. But was the political reality of the Middle Ages really so cleanly divided along gender lines? The formal political systems of medieval Europe were indeed structured around male authority. Women were generally excluded from holding political offices, serving in parliaments or town councils, or participating directly in the feudal relationships that organized medieval society. This formal exclusion was significant and reflected the patriarchal structure of medieval society. However, noble and royal women exercised considerable political power as queens, queen mothers, regents, and consorts. Queens consort, wives of kings, were not merely decorative figures, but often served as advisors to their husbands, represented royal authority when the king was absent, mediated disputes, and built important political alliances through their own family connection. When kings were minors or absent on crusade or military campaigns, queens and noble women frequently served as regents, exercising full political authority. Eleanor of Aquitaine, Blanche of Castile, and Margaret of Denmark are just a few examples of powerful female regents who effectively ruled territories during their sons' minorities or husbands' absences. These weren't anomalies, but standard practices in many medieval kingdoms. Women also exercised political power as heiresses to territories and fiefs. In the absence of male heirs, women could inherit and control significant lands. Eleanor of Aquitaine brought enormous territories to her marriages, first to Louis VII of France and then to Henry II of England, significantly altering the balance of power between these kingdoms. Female lords, often called signoresses in scholarly literature, administered justice, collected revenues, and fulfilled military obligations through deputies. The medieval political system operated largely through networks of family and personal relationships, areas where women played crucial roles. As mothers, daughters, sisters, and wives, women created and maintained kinship, alliances that structured medieval politics. Strategic marriages were fundamental political acts, and women were essential to their success, not just as passive tokens but as active maintainers of family relationships across political boundaries. Queens and noblewomen engaged in patronage, using their resources to support religious institutions, artists, and political allies. This patronage was a significant form of political influence that shaped cultural and social developments. Through selective patronage, women could promote particular religious perspectives, cultural values, and political factions. Women sometimes exercised unusual political authority in specifically female domains. In some regions, abbesses controlled significant territories and exercised powers similar to those of secular lords, including administering justice and collecting taxes. The abbess of Las Huelgas in Castile, for instance, had jurisdiction over more than 50 villages and answered directly to the Pope. Letters, chronicles, and other historical sources reveal that elite women were actively engaged in political affairs. They wrote to and advised rulers, participated in diplomatic negotiations, particularly with other female family members across political boundaries, and sometimes advocated for particular policies or individuals. The fact that medieval chroniclers sometimes complained about meddling or ambitious women in politics suggests that female political activity was common enough to provoke reaction. For non-noble women, political participation took different forms. In towns and cities, guild members' widows sometimes participated in guild governance. During political crises, like food shortages or tax revolts, women participated in collective actions. Court records show women bringing cases and demands to both royal and local courts, engaging with the legal system that was a key part of medieval governance. The exclusion of women from formal political structures was real and significant, reflecting a society organized around patriarchal principles. However, the actual practice of medieval politics was more complex and nuanced than a simple story of male dominance and female exclusion. Women found numerous paths to political influence, despite institutional barriers, making them important players in the political landscape of the Middle Ages. Number 2. Were medieval women's contributions to art and literature completely erased? Have you ever noticed how few female artists and writers from the Middle Ages get mentioned in history books? Is it because they didn't exist, or have their contributions been systematically overlooked? Medieval women created art and literature in numerous forms, though their works have often received less scholarly attention than those of their male contemporaries. The traditional focus on certain types of texts and art forms, those produced in institutional contexts from which women were often excluded, has contributed to the underrepresentation of women's creative work in standard narratives about medieval culture. In literature, several medieval women produced works that have survived and gained recognition. Marie de France, writing in the 12th century, created a collection of lays, narrative poems, that displayed sophisticated literary technique and are now considered classics of medieval literature. Christine de Pizan, active in the late 14th and early 15th centuries, was a professional writer who produced poetry, political treatises, and feminist works like the Book of the City of Ladies, which directly challenged misogynistic tradition. Religious women were particularly active as writers. Hildegard of Bingen produced visionary texts, scientific works, music, and letters that reveal her as a polymath of extraordinary range. Julian of Norwich wrote theological works, exploring her mystical experiences that are still studied today. Hrotsvitha of Gandersheim composed Latin dramas in the 10th century, making her the first known female dramatist in the Western tradition. Women's literary activity extended beyond these exceptional named authors. Nuns copied and illustrated manuscripts, sometimes adding their own commentaries or adaptations. Letters written by women, from queens to merchants' wives, demonstrate high levels of literacy and rhetorical skill. Female scribes, though less common than male ones, appear in the historical record as contributors to manuscript production. In the visual arts, evidence of women's participation comes from various sources. Records show women working as illuminators, artists who decorated manuscripts, embroiderers, textile producers, and occasionally as painters. The Morgan Bible, one of the most famous illuminated manuscripts, contains a colophon production note indicating that 7 of its illuminators were women. Textile arts, often dismissed as craft rather than fine art, were areas where women's artistic contributions were particularly significant. Embroidery works like the Bayeux Tapestry, which, despite its name is actually an embroidered cloth, represent major artistic achievements that combined technical skill with narrative and visual sophistication. While the specific creators of many such works remain anonymous, documentary evidence confirms women's central role in textile production and decoration. Archaeological discoveries have revealed women's involvement in various art forms. Female skeletal remains, found with pigments and tools, suggest some women worked as painters. Evidence of female metalworkers and jewelers has also been discovered, challenging assumptions about gender division in artistic professions. The historical record of women's artistic and literary production has been affected by several factors that have made their contributions less visible. Archives and collections have traditionally preserved works produced in institutional contexts, like universities and courts, where women had limited access. Works in feminine media like textiles have been more vulnerable to physical deterioration. Attribution practices often defaulted to male creators, unless evidence specifically indicated otherwise. Recent scholarship has made significant progress in recovering and reassessing medieval women's contributions to art and literature. Techniques like stylistic analysis, examination of documentary evidence, and consideration of historical context have revealed female creators previously overlooked or misattributed. Digital humanities projects have made women's works more accessible and visible to both scholars and the general public. The myth that medieval women made no significant contributions to art and literature reflects outdated scholarly biases rather than historical reality. While structural barriers certainly limited women's opportunities for artistic and literary expression, medieval women nonetheless created works of significant artistic and intellectual value across multiple media and genres. Number 1. Did medieval women have no freedom and zero agency? Were medieval women really just passive victims with no control over their own lives? Did they simply accept whatever fate men decided for them without ever pushing back or making their own choices? The persistent stereotype of the medieval woman as completely lacking in personal agency is perhaps the most pervasive and damaging myth about women in the Middle Ages. This view portrays medieval women as helpless pawns in a patriarchal society, passively accepting whatever limitations and abuses came their way. But historical evidence reveals a much more complex reality where women regularly demonstrated agency within the constraints of their society. Court records from across medieval Europe show women actively engaging with legal systems to pursue their interests. Women brought lawsuits for debt collection, property disputes, defamation, and even domestic abuse. They testified in court, hired attorneys, negotiated settlements, and sometimes won their cases. Far from passive acceptance of injustice, these records show women strategically using available legal mechanisms to protect their rights and interests. Medieval women made economic decisions with significant consequences. They managed households, ran businesses, particularly as widows, invested money, made purchases, and engaged in market activities. Account books and business records show women making independent financial choices, sometimes in partnership with husbands or male relatives, but often on their own authority, especially as widows or single women. Even wives, whose legal rights were most restricted, often had practical control over household resources and everyday economic decisions. Women's religious choices frequently demonstrated significant personal agency. Some women chose religious life over marriage, sometimes against family wishes. Others joined lay religious movements like the Beguines that allowed for spiritual dedication without formal vows. Female mystics claimed direct communication with God that could challenge or circumvent male ecclesiastical authority. Even within conventional religious frameworks, women made choices about devotional practices, charitable giving, and religious education. Women's resistance to unwanted marriages appears regularly in historical records. While arranged marriages were common, especially for first marriages among the nobility, court cases show women attempting to avoid or escape unwanted matches. Some ran away, others sought annulments based on lack of consent, and some found witnesses to testify that they had previously made marriage contracts with men of their choosing. Even when unsuccessful, these actions demonstrate women actively seeking to shape their own destinies. Medieval literature occasionally depicts women's agency, even within its conventional frameworks. Characters like Chaucer's Wife of Bath or the women in Marie de France's Lays display determination, cleverness, and the ability to pursue their own desires despite social constraints. While literary depictions can't be taken as direct evidence of social reality, they suggest cultural awareness of women's capacity for independent action. Records of criminal cases show medieval women breaking rules and social expectations, sometimes dramatically. Women appear as thieves, fraudsters, adulterers, rebels, and even murderers in court records. While criminal behavior is not positive agency, these cases demonstrate that medieval women were not universally submissive or obedient to authority, whether male or institutional. Women's collective actions occasionally appear in historical records, particularly in urban contexts. Women participated in food riots, tax protests, and guild disputes. They formed informal networks to protect shared interests and sometimes organized to address specific grievances. These collective actions reveal women's capacity to identify shared interests and act together to pursue them. Letters and personal writings by medieval women reveal their inner lives, ambitions, and self-perceptions. These sources show women advising family members, expressing opinions on political matters, making requests, issuing commands, and articulating personal desires. Far from lacking self-awareness or personal will, these writings reveal women with clear senses of identity and purpose. The constraints on medieval women's lives were undeniably significant. Legal systems, economic structures, and social expectations all limited women's options and placed them in subordinate positions relative to men of their social class. But within these constraints, medieval women regularly demonstrated agency through their choices, actions, and resistance to unwanted impositions. Recognizing this agency doesn't minimize the real inequalities they faced, But it does restore to medieval women the human complexity, determination, and ingenuity that stereotypes of passive victimhood have denied them. Does the popular image of medieval women reflect our need for simple narratives rather than the complex reality of the past? And how might our understanding of gender throughout history change if we approach these women not as one-dimensional victims, but as multifaceted human beings navigating their world with whatever tools they had at their disposal?